Easy to forget that the Secure Act was passed not even a year ago at the end of 2019. We kicked off 2020 waiting for guidance on some of the key provisions in order to potentially move forward and implement those in plans. And even in spite of COVID and the way the world has changed, we are now getting that guidance. So plan sponsors may have some opportunities or need to look at changes in plan provisions. One of the potentially biggest opportunities just to expand or enhance plan features is the new in-service withdrawal option. Plans can allow a participant to withdraw up to $5,000 penalty free upon birth of a child or adoption. We've gotten some guidance on that at this point, so pretty close to being in a position to roll those out in plans. Some of the key guidance has included noting that it's a year from the birth of the child or the adoption date that the employee would have to make that withdrawal. That withdrawal can be repaid, and the employee could then request a refund on taxes. And importantly, somewhat similar to the CARES Act, this is self-certification. Employers don't have to request or maintain documentation. In fact, that CARES Act withdrawal was most likely patterned off of this idea of this birth or adoption withdrawal. So another key provision of the Secure Act that we're really waiting on guidance from was the change to part-time employees and their eligibility under plans. And actually, I shouldn't say change because this is a new requirement in addition to the existing part-time requirement. So current law requires that if a part-time employee works 1,000 hours in a plan year, they have to be allowed to defer to the plan. The Secure Act added a second requirement there for long-term part-time employees. If somebody works 500 hours in 3 consecutive years, they also have to be made eligible to defer. A couple of really important guidance points. First, company contributions are separate. Just because a part-time employee is given the opportunity to defer to the plan doesn't mean they have to be eligible for a company contribution. Of course, there are certain non-discrimination tests that need to be considered if part-time employees aren't receiving company contributions, but potentially a positive for companies that have a significant number of part-time employees and we're concerned about cost here. Another important element of the guidance is when we have to start tracking these 3 consecutive years. And the good news is you don't have to go backward. Those can be tracked moving forward. So still a couple years before long-term part-time employees may be entering plans.
So that requires sponsors to count hours, or is there a date equivalent?
Yep. So the guidance here was not specific on that, but generally other guidance that would be presumed to be enforced here allows for equivalencies. So if part-time employees don't have hours tracked, the plan can establish the equivalent number of hours that would be assumed per week. Now that would apply to all part-time employees, can't really have different assumptions based on different types of employees. Does need to be a standard process, but there is some flexibility there for organizations that don't track hours.
There's a lot of industry buzz around participant lifetime income disclosures and how those are going to look and what types of liberties a provider or record keeper can take in showing those numbers. So maybe just talk about the requirement and how we see people sort of satisfying the requirement to disclose this.
Sure. So just very recently, we've gotten some guidance from the regulators as far as how that should be carried out. It's a requirement to put this disclosure on participant statements. And it's essentially converting a participant's current balance to an annuity being initiated at retirement. Now, there are some pretty key assumptions that the regulators really are setting that would need to be consistent across all providers who are preparing and issuing participant statements. That includes the assumed starting age for the annuity. The current proposal is age 67, or the participant's current age if they're above 67. Another really key assumption is mortality table. They're looking to leverage the mortality tables used for pension plans, which is a pretty reasonable assumption. But probably the biggest assumption is around interest rate. What would be the rate on the annuity? And the proposal to date has been to use the 10-year Treasury rate. And that's arguably a really generous rate. The ability for any individual participant to actually go out and buy an annuity at that rate is probably limited. Even in institutional pricing and group annuity pricing, they may not be able to get that level depending on individual characteristics. Of course, fees is another consideration. To date, we haven't seen how any assumptions about participants need to pay fees for an annuity will be worked into this projection. So there's still some questions to be answered, still waiting for the final regulation to be issued that really illustrates what has to be disclosed. A really key concern and one area that has, I think, kept this requirement from moving forward for many years is just the idea of if participants will really understand what it's intended to do. The intention here is to be educational, to help participants understand how their account balance may transfer into lifetime income or just income, period, in retirement. The concern, of course, is that participants will perceive this as some kind of guarantee, and that will introduce risk for plan sponsor fiduciaries or service providers who are preparing these disclosures.